Steve Harvey had hosted Family Feud for more than a decade and thought he had developed the emotional fortitude to handle any revelation that might emerge on his stage. But on a humid afternoon in August of 2024, he was about to hear a confession so morally complex and emotionally devastating that he would find himself physically unable to remain in place, walking off the stage mid-taping while cameras continued rolling, and the studio audience sat in shocked silence trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The atmosphere in the studio carried the familiar energy of a game show taping, with two families positioned on stage, ready to compete for prize money, cameras recording what everyone anticipated would be another episode filled with laughter and perhaps a few touching family moments. What nobody could have predicted was that an 89-year-old woman was about to reveal what her husband had done 70 years earlier in 1954, a confession that would force everyone present to confront uncomfortable truths about courage, sacrifice, racism, and the terrible prices some people paid for doing what they believed was right during one of the darkest periods in American history. Before we continue with this profound and difficult story, if you value learning about the real human costs of fighting injustice and the complicated legacies that moral courage can leave behind, please take a moment to press that like button and subscribe to our channel, because what you are about to hear represents a piece of American history that never made it into textbooks but deserves to be remembered and understood. The Peterson family from Ohio stood on one side of the stage, their matching royal blue shirts displaying their family name, their expressions reflecting enthusiasm and competitive energy as they prepared for the game ahead. On the opposite side stood the Wilson family from Mississippi, equally prepared and displaying the kind of multi-generational unity that makes Family Feud particularly compelling television. Among the Wilson family members stood someone who immediately commanded attention through a combination of advanced age and an almost palpable sense of gravity that seemed to surround her like an invisible weight. Ruth Wilson was 89 years old, standing with the support of a walker that her great-grandson had carefully positioned beside her, her silver hair styled in soft waves that framed a face marked by nearly 9 decades of living, and her dark eyes holding depths of experience and memory that suggested she had witnessed and endured things most people could never imagine. She wore a simple navy dress with a white collar, an outfit her granddaughter had helped her select, and around her neck hung a small silver cross that she touched occasionally with fingers gnarled by arthritis, but still steady with purpose. Ruth had been born in 1935 in rural Mississippi, the third of 8 children in a black family that worked as sharecroppers on land they would never own, laboring under a system that was barely distinguishable from the slavery that had supposedly ended 70 years earlier. Her childhood had been marked by grinding poverty, limited access to education due to the deliberately inadequate schools provided for black children in the segregated South, constant awareness of the racial violence that could erupt at any moment for any perceived transgression of the rigid social codes that governed interactions between black and white people, and the kind of daily humiliation and dehumanization that was simply accepted as the normal order of things in Mississippi during the 1930s and 40s. Despite these circumstances, Ruth's parents had instilled in their children a strong sense of dignity, a commitment to education however limited the opportunities might be, faith that sustained them through impossible circumstances, and a quiet but firm belief that the unjust world they inhabited would not last forever, even though change seemed impossibly distant. Ruth had been a bright student despite attending a one-room schoolhouse with inadequate materials, shared textbooks, and teachers who themselves had limited formal education, but did their best with almost no resources or support. She had harbored dreams of becoming a teacher, though such aspirations seemed unrealistic for a black girl from a sharecropping family in Mississippi, where even completing high school represented an achievement beyond the reach of most children, who needed to work in the fields to help their families survive. Everything in Ruth's life changed in 1953 when she met James Wilson, a young man who had recently returned to Mississippi after serving in the Korean War, carrying with him the complicated perspective of someone who had fought for a country that denied him basic rights and dignity based solely on the color of his skin. James had been 22 years old, working at a lumber mill and trying to build a life in a place that seemed determined to limit every possibility available to him But he had possessed a quiet strength and a refusal to internalize the degradation that the system of segregation attempted to impose on every black person in the South. James and Ruth had met at church, the institution that served as the center of black community life in the segregated South, providing not just spiritual sustenance but also social connection, mutual support, and a space where black people could assert their full humanity away from the dehumanizing gaze of white supremacy. Their courtship had developed over months of supervised visits, church socials, and carefully chaperoned walks, and they had married in June of 1954 in a simple ceremony that brought together their families and community in celebration despite the difficult circumstances that surrounded their lives. They had begun their married life in a small house on the outskirts of town, with James working at the lumber mill and Ruth taking in laundry and ironing from white families to supplement their modest income, both of them dreaming of a better future while navigating the daily realities of life under Jim Crow segregation. What Ruth's family did not know, what she had deliberately concealed for 70 years, was that just 3 months after their wedding in September of 1954, James had done something that would alter the trajectory of their entire lives and ultimately cost him everything he had worked for and hoped to achieve. The event had occurred during a period of escalating racial tension in Mississippi following the Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in May of 1954, which had declared school segregation unconstitutional and sent shockwaves through the South, where the entire social and economic structure depended on maintaining rigid racial separation. White supremacists had responded to the decision with increased violence and intimidation designed to terrorize black communities and prevent any movement toward actual integration or equality, and Mississippi had become particularly dangerous for black people, as the white citizens' councils organized to resist any change to the racial order. In September of 1954, a black family named the Washingtons who lived near James and Ruth had become targets of white supremacist violence after the father, Thomas Washington, had attempted to register to vote, an act that was technically legal but practically impossible for black people in Mississippi, where white officials used literacy tests, poll taxes, and outright intimidation to prevent black political participation. Thomas Washington had been a respected member of the black community, a World War II veteran who operated a small independent farm that he actually owned, rather than sharecropped, representing a level of economic independence that white supremacists found threatening because it challenged the narrative that black people were naturally inferior and incapable of success without white supervision and control. When Thomas had appeared at the courthouse to register to vote, he had been turned away and warned not to return, and within days, threatening messages had been left at his farm, crosses had been burned in his fields, and it had become clear that serious violence was imminent. James had learned about the threats against the Washington family through the informal communication network that existed within the black community, and he had felt compelled to act despite the obvious danger to himself and his new wife. He had gone to the Washington home one evening and told Thomas that he needed to leave Mississippi immediately with his wife and 4 children, that the threats were credible and serious, and that staying would likely result in the family being killed as a message to other black people not to challenge white supremacy. Thomas had been reluctant to abandon the farm that represented years of work and sacrifice, but James had convinced him that land could be replaced, but lives could not, and that his children deserved a chance to grow up somewhere less dangerous. James had then done something extraordinary and incredibly risky. He had offered to help the Washington family escape, providing them with money that he and Ruth had been saving for their own future, arranging transportation through connections he had made during his military service, and most significantly, creating a distraction that would give the Washingtons time to get away before their absence was discovered. The distraction James had created involved setting fire to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a building that was scheduled for demolition, but that in burning would draw attention and emergency response away from the roads the Washingtons would use to leave Mississippi. James had waited until late at night, had carefully started the fire in a way designed to minimize risk to other structures while creating enough spectacle to occupy local attention, and had then returned home to Ruth without explaining where he had been or what he had done. The warehouse had burned completely. The fire department had responded, and in the confusion and excitement of fighting the blaze, nobody had noticed the Washington family loading their possessions into a borrowed truck and driving north toward family in Chicago, who had agreed to take them in until they could establish themselves in a new location. James had believed that his role in helping the Washingtons escape would remain unknown, that the fire would be attributed to accident or unknown causes, and that he and Ruth could continue building their life without consequences from his decision to help a family escape racist violence. But James had underestimated both the determination of white supremacists to identify and punish anyone who had helped the Washingtons, and the willingness of some people within the black community to betray others in hopes of protecting themselves from white violence. Within 2 weeks of the Washington family's disappearance, rumors had begun circulating that James had been involved in their escape, and someone, whether out of fear or malice or some combination of both, had informed white authorities that James had started the warehouse fire as a diversion. James had been arrested on arson charges, taken from his home early one morning by sheriff's deputies, who had handled him with casual brutality while Ruth watched helplessly, and held in the county jail where he had been subjected to beatings designed to extract a confession not just to the arson, but to any other acts of resistance or defiance he might have committed. James had refused to confess, had refused to implicate anyone else, and had maintained that he knew nothing about the warehouse fire or the Washington family's departure. After 3 days of detention and abuse, James had been released without charges, the authorities apparently deciding that they lacked sufficient evidence to secure a conviction even in the rigged judicial system of Mississippi, where black defendants faced all-white juries and judges who openly supported segregation. But James's release from jail had not meant the end of consequences for his actions. He had lost his job at the lumber mill within days, with his employer making clear that no white-owned business would hire someone suspected of helping black people challenge the racial order. Ruth had lost the laundry and ironing work she had been doing for white families, as word spread that she was married to a troublemaker and should not be employed or supported in any way. The informal economic boycott had been devastatingly effective, leaving James and Ruth with no income and no prospects in a community that had decided to punish them for James's perceived transgression. They had struggled for months, surviving on the charity of friends and family within the black community who themselves had very little to spare, and facing a future that seemed to offer only continued poverty and marginalization in Mississippi. In early 1955, James had made the difficult decision that they needed to leave Mississippi, that staying would mean a life of perpetual punishment, and that their children, if they were blessed with any, would grow up in a place that had marked their family as acceptable targets for economic and potentially physical violence. He and Ruth had left everything behind, using borrowed money to travel north to Detroit, where James had a cousin who worked in an automotive factory and who had connections that might lead to employment. They had arrived in Detroit with almost nothing, had lived in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood of other Southern black migrants, who had fled the violence and oppression of Jim Crow, and had slowly, painfully, rebuilt their lives in a northern city that offered more opportunities than Mississippi, but came with its own forms of racism and economic exploitation. James had found work in an automotive factory, laboring on assembly lines in conditions that were physically demanding and dangerous, and Ruth had found work as a domestic servant for wealthy white families, cleaning houses and caring for children while leaving her own children with relatives or neighbors. They had worked grueling hours, saved every penny they could, and eventually achieved a modest but stable working-class life that allowed them to purchase a small house, raise 4 children who would all graduate from high school and 3 of whom would attend college, and build connections within Detroit's black community. But James had carried the weight of what happened in Mississippi for his entire life: the guilt over having to flee rather than stay and fight, the anger over the injustice of being punished for helping a family escape violence, and the complicated grief over leaving behind family and community in the place where he had been born and raised. What Ruth had never told her children, what she had deliberately concealed throughout their entire lives, was the full story of why they had left Mississippi and what their father had done in 1954 that had made that departure necessary. She had told them only that their father had lost his job, and they had moved north for better opportunities. A narrative that was technically true, but that omitted the crucial context of James's act of resistance and the retribution it had provoked. She had made this choice partly because James had asked her to keep silent, fearing that if their children knew the truth, they might speak about it in ways that could endanger relatives who remained in Mississippi, where white supremacist violence against black people continued throughout the 1950s and 60s. She had also kept silent because the story was painful and complicated, raising questions about heroism and sacrifice that she had not known how to explain to young children. And as years passed, the silence had become habitual and the truth had seemed increasingly distant and perhaps unnecessary to share. James had died in 1998 at age 67, his health broken by decades of hard physical labor in the automotive factory, and he had gone to his grave without his children knowing the full truth of what he had done and what it had cost him. Ruth had continued to keep the secret even after James's death, partly out of habit, and partly because she had not known how to suddenly reveal a truth that she had concealed for more than 4 decades. But as Ruth had aged, and as the years had accumulated, she had felt increasing urgency about telling the truth before she died, ensuring that her children and grandchildren knew who James had really been and what he had sacrificed. The recent national reckoning with racial injustice following the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests had intensified Ruth's conviction that the story needed to be told, that James deserved to be remembered not just as a factory worker, but as someone who had risked everything to help others escape racist violence. Now standing on the Family Feud stage at 89 years old with her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren surrounding her, Ruth felt the weight of her 70-year silence pressing on her with unbearable intensity. Her decision to participate in this game show appearance had been her great-grandson's idea, proposed as a way to celebrate Ruth's upcoming 90th birthday and create a happy family memory. Ruth had agreed but had decided that this public setting would be the moment when she finally told the truth, when she revealed what James had done in 1954 and why they had left Mississippi, using the cameras and the public nature of the occasion to force herself to actually speak the words she had been holding back for 7 decades. Steve Harvey began his introduction of the families with characteristic warmth and energy, clearly pleased by the multi-generational nature of both competing families. When he reached Ruth, Steve paused with obvious respect and gentle concern, taking in the elderly woman who represented both the oldest contestant he had hosted in quite some time and someone whose bearing suggested she had lived through experiences worth hearing about. He asked Ruth her age, and when she replied that she was 89 years old, the audience responded with enthusiastic applause, and several people called out words of admiration and encouragement. Steve commented on how remarkable it was to see someone of Ruth's age looking engaged and determined, and he asked what brought her to Family Feud at this stage of life. Ruth smiled, a complex expression that held both warmth and something deeper and more troubled, and she replied that she had come to create a memory with her family, but also to finally tell a truth she should have told many years ago. Steve's expression shifted slightly, sensing that something significant might be coming, though he could not have anticipated what Ruth was preparing to reveal. He asked Ruth to tell him about her family, and Ruth introduced her children and grandchildren with obvious love and pride, describing their various accomplishments and the lives they had built. Steve then asked about Ruth's late husband, and Ruth's face changed as she spoke about James, describing him as the best man she had ever known, someone who had done something extraordinarily brave when he was young and had paid a terrible price for that courage. The game began, and both families competed with enthusiasm and good spirits. Ruth participated when it was her turn, displaying mental sharpness that impressed everyone present, and her family members kept glancing at her with obvious affection. The competition was close and engaging, with both families performing well. The Wilson family ultimately prevailed in the main game, and they advanced to fast money with Ruth's granddaughter going first and scoring 142 points. The family needed only 58 additional points to win the $20,000 prize, and they began discussing who should take the second position. Ruth surprised everyone by stating firmly that she would do it, that she had come for this moment, and she was not going to let anyone else take it from her. Her children looked concerned about the pressure on their elderly mother, but Ruth's expression made clear this was not negotiable. She made her way to the fast money podium with careful steps, and Steve approached her with admiration and concern. The questions came quickly, and Ruth answered each one with calm confidence, completing all 5 before the buzzer sounded. Steve revealed her results, and Ruth had scored 73 points, bringing the family total to 215. The Wilson family had won decisively, and the studio erupted in celebration. But as her family embraced her in joy, Ruth raised her hand and asked everyone to please be quiet because she needed to say something important before another moment passed. The studio fell silent. Confused by the sudden seriousness in the midst of celebration, Steve moved closer, asking if everything was all right. Ruth nodded and told Steve that everything was fine, but that she needed to tell her family the truth about what their father and grandfather had done in 1954, and she needed to do it now while cameras were recording so that the truth would be preserved and remembered. Ruth's children looked at each other with confusion, clearly unable to imagine what their mother might need to confess about events that occurred 70 years ago. Ruth took a deep breath, touched the cross at her throat, and began to speak. She told her family that everything they believed about why they had left Mississippi and moved to Detroit was incomplete, that there was a story she had never told them about their father's courage and the price he had paid for doing what was right. The studio audience sat in absolute silence as Ruth's story began to unfold. Ruth explained that in September of 1954, just 3 months after she and James had married, a black family called the Washingtons had been threatened with violence for attempting to register to vote. She described how James had helped that family escape Mississippi, providing money they had been saving, arranging transportation, and creating a diversion by setting fire to an abandoned warehouse to occupy attention while the Washingtons fled north. She explained that James had been arrested and beaten, that they had both lost their jobs and been economically destroyed through an organized boycott, and that they had been forced to flee Mississippi to avoid continued retribution. Ruth's voice grew thick with emotion as she told her children that their father had never wanted them to know this story because he feared it might endanger them or cause them to carry anger about injustices they were powerless to change. She explained that she had honored his wish for silence even after his death, but that she could not leave this world without them knowing who James had really been, what he had sacrificed, and why they had grown up in Detroit rather than Mississippi. She told them that their father had been a hero who had risked everything to help others escape racist violence, and that his courage in 1954 had shaped every aspect of their lives, even though they had never known the truth. The studio remained frozen in silence as Ruth continued. She told her family that she had recently learned, through genealogy research that one of her granddaughters had been conducting, that the Washington family had survived and thrived in Chicago, that Thomas Washington's children had become a teacher, a nurse, and a businessman, and that his grandchildren had achieved even more, including one who had become a federal judge. She said that the Washingtons had never forgotten what James had done for them, and that when contacted through the genealogy research, they had expressed profound gratitude for a man they had never been able to properly thank because doing so would have endangered him further. Ruth's oldest son found his voice, asking in a tone of shocked emotion why their mother had never told them any of this, why she had allowed them to grow up not knowing about their father's extraordinary act of courage. Ruth's answer was honest and painful. She told them that she had kept silent because James had asked her to, because revealing the truth might have endangered relatives who remained in Mississippi during the violent civil rights era, and because, as years passed, the silence had become habit and the burden of revelation had seemed too heavy to bear. She said she was telling them now because she was 89 years old and could not risk dying without them knowing the truth, and because the recent national conversation about racial justice had made clear that these stories needed to be told and remembered rather than buried in silence. Steve Harvey stood completely still, tears streaming down his face as Ruth's confession continued. When she finished, explaining that James had died never receiving recognition or acknowledgement for what he had done beyond the quiet gratitude of the Washington family, Steve stood motionless for several long seconds. Then, without warning, Steve turned and walked off the stage, his shoulders shaking with emotion, unable to remain in place while processing the weight of what he had just heard. The cameras continued rolling, capturing Steve's departure and the stunned silence that filled the studio. Production assistants looked uncertain about whether to cut cameras or continue filming. The audience sat frozen, many people crying openly. Ruth's family surrounded her, embracing her while trying to absorb the magnitude of what they had just learned about their father and grandfather. After nearly 2 minutes that felt like an eternity, Steve returned to the stage, his face wet with tears, his composure shattered but his determination to honor Ruth's story evident in his expression. Steve approached Ruth and told her, his voice broken and rough, that what she had just shared was one of the most important stories he had ever heard, that James Wilson's courage in 1954 represented exactly the kind of heroism that American history had systematically ignored and erased, and that her decision to finally speak the truth after 70 years was itself an act of courage that honored James's memory. He turned to address the cameras directly, telling the audience that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a revelation that challenged comfortable narratives about history and forced recognition of the real human costs of fighting against racial injustice in a time when such resistance could literally destroy your life. Steve announced that he could not let this moment pass with just the standard $20,000 prize. He said he would personally donate $100,000 to establish a scholarship fund in James Wilson's name for descendants of people who had resisted racial injustice during the Jim Crow era and for young people committed to continuing the fight for racial justice today. The audience erupted in applause, standing to honor both Ruth's revelation and Steve's response. The episode aired 6 weeks later, and the response was immediate, overwhelming, and deeply emotional. The clip of Ruth's confession and Steve's walk-off went viral within hours, viewed by tens of millions of people around the world. Comments poured in from viewers describing how the story had changed their understanding of the civil rights era and the individual acts of courage that had challenged white supremacy long before the famous protests and marches of the 1960s. Historians and civil rights scholars praised Ruth for revealing a story that represented countless similar acts of resistance and sacrifice that had been lost to history because the people who performed them had been forced into silence and exile. The Washington family, descendants of the family James had helped escape Mississippi in 1954, reached out to Ruth's family after seeing the episode. The two families met in an emotional reunion that brought together the children and grandchildren of the man who had risked everything to help and the family who had benefited from that sacrifice. Thomas Washington's daughter, now 75 years old, shared memories of that terrifying night when her family had fled Mississippi, and she told Ruth's children that her father had spoken often about James Wilson and had carried gratitude for his courage until his death in 1989. She revealed that her father had tried to find James in the decades after leaving Mississippi, but had been unable to locate him, not knowing that James and Ruth had settled in Detroit under circumstances that made maintaining connections to their Mississippi past dangerous. The scholarship fund that Steve Harvey established grew beyond his initial contribution as donations poured in from viewers moved by James Wilson's story. Within 6 months, the fund had received more than $800,000 in contributions, and it began providing scholarships to students studying civil rights, history, social justice, and activism. The first recipient was one of Ruth's own great-grandchildren, who had been inspired by learning about her great-grandfather's courage to pursue a degree in African American studies with focus on documenting unrecorded acts of resistance during the Jim Crow era. Ruth herself became an advocate for recovering and preserving hidden civil rights histories, speaking at universities, museums, and community organizations about the importance of telling stories that had been suppressed out of fear or simply lost to time. She emphasized that James's story was not unique, that countless black people had performed similar acts of resistance and sacrifice during the Jim Crow era, and that many of those stories had died with the people who lived them because speaking about such actions had been too dangerous and the silence had become permanent. She worked with historians and archivists to document what she remembered about the black community in Mississippi during the 1950s, providing details about the informal networks of mutual support and resistance that had sustained black people during one of the most oppressive periods in American history. Ruth lived for 2 more years after her Family Feud revelation, passing away peacefully at age 91, surrounded by her family in the Detroit home she had shared with James for decades. At her funeral, her children spoke openly about their father's courage in 1954 and their mother's courage in finally revealing a truth she had carried in silence for 70 years. They acknowledged that learning this story had fundamentally changed their understanding of their family history and their own identity, and they committed to ensuring that James Wilson's sacrifice would be remembered and honored rather than lost to the silence that had concealed it for so long. If this story of an elderly woman who finally revealed her husband's act of resistance against racial injustice in 1954 has moved you or changed your understanding of the individual acts of courage that challenged white supremacy long before the famous civil rights protests, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with anyone who needs to understand the real human costs of fighting against injustice. With students learning about civil rights history, and with families who carry their own untold stories of resistance and sacrifice. Ruth and James Wilson taught us that moral courage often comes with devastating personal costs, that doing the right thing can literally destroy your life in a society built on injustice, and that countless acts of heroism have been lost to history because speaking about them was too dangerous and the silence became permanent. They demonstrated that it is never too late to speak the truth, that revealing long-concealed stories honors those who made sacrifices we never knew about, and that preserving these histories matters for understanding both where we came from and how far we still need to go in achieving genuine justice and equality. Thank you for witnessing this profound revelation of a secret kept for 70 years. And may we all find the courage to tell difficult truths and to honor those who risked everything to resist injustice even when their acts of courage went unrecognized and unrewarded.